I'll go ahead and do the introduction. Mr. Rummell has asked me to be brief, and I think it's a really good idea because we want to give him the stage here. He got his start in 1971 at Sea Pines. How many of you have seen Sea Pines at Hilton Head? Very few of you. You got to go there sometime. It's an amazing community. He went from there to Sawgrass in Ponte Vedra and became the general manager of that project over in near Jacksonville. And from there, after a couple of hops, he became the president of Disney Development Company. How many of you have heard of Disney? This was the company that managed all of their non-theme park land everywhere. Orlando, Anaheim, Paris, Tokyo. And after building 20,000 hotel units and a little town called Celebration, how many of you have seen Celebration? Again, okay, more of you. You know it's a unique and trend-setting place. It's a model to see. Okay, after doing that, he became chairman of all of Disney's land development, both theme parks and non-theme park. He then took over the St. Joe's Corporation when they were transitioning from one of the world's largest, if not the largest, timber and paper mill operation to urban operations. Now, to give you some idea of St. Joe's, I think the land they held is roughly equivalent to this entire county here in Florida. And so a major operation by any measure. He's on the board of many major companies. But I think one interesting thing about him is his interest in education. It looks to me like he spends about half of his time involved in it. His public service includes chairman of the Council of 100, the most prestigious business group in Florida. And he's also been involved with the Alliance for World-Class Education, Teach for America, Foundation for Florida's Future. And in the meantime, he co-chaired the Super Bowl committee for Jacksonville, which is roughly equivalent in my mind to hosting a political convention. So a man who has done virtually everything, and now he is chairing the 30,000 member Urban Land Institute, the most prestigious organization in real estate development and real estate. And as he was explaining a moment ago, rapidly expanding throughout the world. So we are really pleased. Oh, to be fair, he's a graduate of North Carolina and Wharton, and we are very, very pleased to have him here at our campus. Peter, welcome.
Thank you. Am I on? Can you hear me? I'm delighted to be here. I've actually spoken at a couple of other college campuses, but this is the first time I've invaded the SEC. As you said, I went to undergraduate school at Chapel Hill. I told some friends of mine I was coming, and they gave me all kinds of advice. They said, "Well, you should put on a Florida hat." So that seemed to me pandering. They said, "Well, you should put on a UNC hat." That seemed to me stupid. So I'm here with no hat. And what I want to do is talk about something that I've been involved with a good deal of my life, and I think has become more and more important. And I'm going to call it, for want of something else, the creative process. You all are going to be involved in it in lots of different ways, some of which are obvious, some of which aren't. And I want to spend about 30 minutes talking to you about what I've learned from my experiences in both in trying to manage a creative process, but also just in terms of being part of it in the earlier part of my career. And I think hopefully there are some. I'm going to try and be fairly tactical about it, because I think there's an aura about creativity that lots of people sort of get intimidated by, and I don't think that's really justified. And it's gotten worse in the last year or so after the death of Steve Jobs. He had such a mystique around him, and there was such a mystique around Apple that I think the idea of creativity and what it takes to be a creative person or run a creative environment has gotten an awful lot of attention and energy, And I think a little bit of it, at least from my experience, and particularly in terms of real estate, is a little bit misguided. And so I want to see if we can take some of the mystery out of that. Wayne mentioned I started my career on a little place nobody had ever heard of called Hilton Head Island, South Carolina in 1971. And I want to talk about two of the most creative people I ever worked for before I get into some more specific things. One of them was a guy named Charles Frazier, who most of you probably never heard of, who's the guy who founded Hilton Head and then the development enterprise that went with it. And the other is Walt Disney, who you've obviously all heard of. And I want to talk a little bit about characteristics of the two of them and what I think were both the pluses and minuses of their style and what they did. Charles Frazier was really the first of the large-scale resort developers who figured out, and this sounds so stupid now because you all have just grown up with it, but Frazier started on Hilton Head in the late 60s and early 70s, and he inherited the land from his father, 5 miles of beachfront, 10,000 acres of land, and started selling the beachfront properties to single-family uses, and that went pretty well. But he was smart enough to realize that he got along to about the 3rd mile, and he realized that he was going to run out of beachfront land, and if he couldn't figure out some way to make the rest of it attractive, he was going to be in trouble. So he got the crazy idea of building a golf course through the middle of the woods, and decided that maybe somebody would pay a premium to live on a golf course versus live in the woods. Now we've all seen hundreds and hundreds of golf courses around the country, and that's just, some of your parents may live on one, and that's just an accepted sort of module. But in 1970, that was revolutionary, and it was a big deal. And he was able to do that because he was willing to think out of the box and because he was willing to take some risks. I want to compare him a little bit to Walt Disney. I'm going to be careful with the comparison here because I don't want to force it and be unfair to either one. But they were both interesting, creative guys, and they had some things in common. I did not meet Walt Disney. He died in 1967, but I spent 13 years at the very senior levels of the Walt Disney Company, and his ethos and his presence was so strong. I feel like I knew him. He literally was living inside the company, which actually was sort of part of the problem for Disney after Walt died. Both men were fundamentally poor managers in the typical sense of the word, but both also had this ability to, both saw just endless possibilities and could look at things and see not only what's there, but what's not there, which I think is one of the definitions of creativity. Charles flew at 50,000 feet, and God help you if he landed. We used to all sort of spend our time trying to keep him elevated, and he liked being there, but he also was a tinkerer, and it was a small company compared to Disney, and he would swoop down every once in a while, and typically you'd spend the rest of the month sort of cleaning up what he did. He had I vividly remember one banker meeting when we were just starting to get in trouble in the early 70s. This was when one of the first real estate cycles after World War II in the early 70s, interest rates went up and things got into lots of trouble. To give you some idea of Charles's optimism, in 1973, this was a tiny little company, had revenues of $40 or $50 million, and Sea Pines, which is the name of the company, the Sea Pines Company, was the largest recruiter at the Harvard Business School. Bigger than McKinsey, bigger than then Chase Bank, bigger than IBM. So everybody Charles hired was smart, but they had no experience. Walt Disney, on the other hand, so Charles surrounded himself with very, very smart people who had no experience. Walt Disney, on the other hand, was famous for surrounding himself with people who wouldn't argue with him, but just yes people who would say, yes, Walt, let's do that. And what you find is that one had a bias towards smart but inexperienced. The other had a bias towards experienced but not argumentative. And I got to tell you, neither one of those is worth a damn. But these were two very, very incredibly smart, powerful, capable people who both had a blind spot. They were both risk takers to an extreme. The stories of how Walt Disney bet the company on Snow White are famous. Charles did the same thing. He bet the company on acquisitions, grew far faster than our balance sheet could afford it, and paid a price for that. I remember just as we were starting to get into trouble in 1974, Charles loved maps, and he had maps all over the place. He used to have a map of the Southeast, and he had pins in it for all the places where we either owned property or wanted to own property. Well, we didn't, unbeknownst to us, just before the bankers' meeting, he replaced the map of the Southeast with a map of the world. And he had pins in the United States, but he had pins all over the place. And then the bankers walked in just as they were realizing that we didn't have the monthly cash flow we needed, and that was the beginning of the end. So if you have a vision, sometimes it's a good idea to keep it from your bankers until you're sure it's going to work. You know, the lessons are obvious. The dreamers need controllers, and controllers need to have people to help them dream. But the thing I want to talk about, and the thing that I think is important, particularly in talking about these two guys, is that, as I said, they were both out of balance. They were both visionaries, but they both had an Achilles heel, and that was they had a blind spot about what they didn't know. So the fact is that you need both. You need people who will challenge you. You need people who will push you. You also need a structure where when somebody says no, you get forced to listen, at least to a reasonable degree. So that's what I want to talk about that. But I want to start with three lessons from these guys and talk about that a minute, and then talk a little more generically. The first word I want to use in terms of talking to Fraser and Disney is balance. There's no question. All of the bright young people who were there in the early 70s realized that we were at a point in time. And a lot of those people were still in the higher echelons of the real estate business around the United States and actually around the world. So we learned an enormous amount from him, but we also learned some things. I think we took some things that were positives and some things that were negative. One of the things I took from him was, and I think it's still with me, is a huge respect for energy. This was before David Halberstam wrote a famous book called The Best and the Brightest in the 70s. If Charles had written the book, it would have been called The Brightest but the Unexperienced. It was, I don't include myself in that brightest category. I slipped through the cracks somehow. But it was a point in time, and the thing that everybody had was energy. And I don't mean the kind of energy that means that you can't focus and that you're ADD. I mean the kind of energy that says you'll go the extra mile. You'll do something else. You'll stay up late. You'll go there. And I think to this day, that's one of the things that I use when I screen people. It's almost subliminal, but I look for that fundamental energy, that fundamental need to get things done as a driver. Now, how you present that to recruiters and how you present that to future employers is something you're going to have to figure out because you have to do it in a way that's credible, and you don't do it by just sort of shaking and saying, "Put me in, coach." You've got to do it in a way that's transparent. The second word that excuse me one second. The second word that goes along with that is balance. They were out of balance. Neither one of them had the balance that was necessary, and neither one knew what they didn't know. They appreciated what they knew, but they didn't appreciate what they didn't know, and that can be an enormous mistake. The recruiting from a couple of schools and only hiring the best and the brightest, but with no experience, was an attention to educational details as opposed to an attention to experience, and that in fact will drive you into a ditch very quickly, and I think we found that. Don't discount experience when you try to get yourself into a position. When you're looking for a job, think about what you can take to that job, but also think about what that job can give to you. And don't get sucked in by somebody who's a charismatic leader but doesn't have the balance that we're talking about. Because you're there, whether this is your first job or your 10th job, you're there to contribute, but you're also there to learn. And you have to keep in mind that I'm 66 years old and I'm still learning all the time. And that comes from being able to see different people in different lights and get different things from different people. I think it's an important characteristic, and if you get sort of mesmerized by somebody who has a big personality or has a big reputation, sort of the Donald Trump sort of people of the world, you're going to end up with a flat experience, and that's going to be to your expense. The third word I would use, balance and energy. The third word I would use to describe these two guys is questions. Charles particularly was, I think, maybe the best read person I've still ever met in my 43-year business career. And he took great pride in it, and he loved to almost play stump the band with you, and not in an egotistical way to embarrass you, but he loved to read on a wide variety of subjects, and one of the tricks I learned from him was that even if you didn't know something, you knew enough other things that you could always change the subject and somehow still bring it around to something you wanted to talk about. It was a masterful art that he had. But it's also an ability to connect dots. It's an ability to see things that are there, but also to see things that aren't there. And the more you know, the more you have a varied experience, the wider your range of interest are, the more you're going to be able to see things and put them together in ways that maybe other people don't. And we're going to talk about in a minute, that's one of the keys to the creative process. How do you see things in ways that other people don't see them? So I want to turn now to talk about the creative process that I have experienced. I ran a thing called Walt Disney Imagineering, which was the think tank for the Disney company for everything except animation. And it was a real estate development company, but I think I'm the only real estate developer in the country who had poets on staff. And it was a diverse group of people, and we did the theme park rides, we did the real estate development around the parks, did office buildings for the corporation around the world. So it was a very mixed thing, but it was, in its essence, it was a thing that Walt Disney himself put together to build the first theme park. In Disneyland opened in Anaheim in 1955. And that was the first of its kind. Walt invented the theme park business, and he did it by creating this Imagineering group of people who were not developers and not animators and not engineers and not designers, but they were all of those things, and that was the culture that stayed there. And it was an important part of learning how to manage that process was an interesting challenge, and I want to talk a little bit about how we did that. But I think it applies not just to real estate. I think it applies to anything. It applies to any creative process. It could apply to a classroom. It could apply to teaching something. It could apply to any business. I want to make some observations about how I think you can nurture and manage that process in any business setting. But first, let's start with some definitions. Let's understand and let's distinguish between a great idea and the creative process. We've all had great ideas. Typically, they involve 4 or 5 or 8 friends, some relaxed atmosphere, and 9 times out of 10, some beer or wine. And somebody will start talking about the vacation they want to take. And everybody will pile on and say, yeah, let's go do that. Or somebody will talk about a business idea they had, and they'll say, yeah, that's a great idea, but it'd be better if you did this, or it'd be better if you did that. And you get the combined energy of all those people who are focused and care about it and are interested, and that is an interesting experience. You've all had that. And then the group breaks up, but before they break up, they decide that Fred's going to call the travel agent, and they're going to book that weekend in Cancun because it sounded like so much fun. Or Mary's going to call her banker and see just how hard it is to get a loan to really put some money behind this idea and see if we can really make this into the next whatever we want it to be. We've all had that experience. You've also had the experience of going home, committed that you're going to do it, and then you wake up the next morning and go to work and forget about it. So, what you have had has been fun. What you have had has been a wonderful experience with friends, but you have not had a creative experience. You have had a good time. So how do you take that and capture it and make it into something? How do you take the good ideas that we think we all hear, that we've all been around, and turn it into something that's actually productive? And it doesn't have to be a business. It can be a class lecture. It can be a hobby. It can be a relationship with a friend. It can be anything. But the question is, how do you take that germ of an idea and make it into something that has legs? So let's start. I think I'm going to break it down into 5 phases, and see if we can. I don't want to try and make this sound like algebra, because there's still some chemistry and some elixir left in this thing. But I think if you understand that there's a process on top of the magic, you're going to have a far better chance of being successful. One of the things you have to realize is that it all starts with a spark. It goes back to your friends and the wine. It starts with a spark. And if you don't have the spark, then you don't have anything. The problem is most sparks never go anywhere. They don't start a fire. So one of the things I've learned, at least from my experience, is that very few great ideas that actually become something start as a lightning bolt. Most things, there are examples of things that just kind of grew out of whole cloth, but those are enormous exceptions. Those are not the rule. The more likely than not, it starts in one form, it gets pushed, it gets tugged, it gets bent, it gets reshaped, it gets repainted, and then it ends up in that form that we will then call the idea. And running that creative process from that spark, from that conversation, to what I will call the idea is a very complicated process, and it's something that encourages free flow, encourages out of the box, break the mold thinking, but it also requires a certain subtle piece of limitations and boundaries, and the secret of managing that process is knowing how to use that. And it's like an accordion. How do you pull it back and forth and let the group run and then pull it back? We'll talk more about that in a minute. So in order to play that accordion, in order to develop that environment that says we're going to pursue this idea until it's an idea, what do you have? What do you need to do? Well, I'm in a subset here, but I think there are 2 or 3 things that it takes to manage a spark to get it to the idea, to get it to the point where it's an idea. Number 1, you have to create an environment that says, I'm not going to laugh at you. That no ideas are bad ideas. you need smart people, but you don't need the people with the highest IQs. My experience sometimes is that big IQs get in the way because contests become a debating society, or they become some opportunity to show that I'm smarter than you are. And that's not how ideas are born. Ideas are born through back and forth and through the process that it takes. So you need people who are observant, people who are willing to listen to other people, and people who will take an idea and hold on to it and grasp it and think about it and throw it back out with something else. This process is by definition an inventing process, but everybody has to understand from day one that first efforts very seldom succeed. So you've got to start, you've got to stop, you've got to go right, you've got to go left, you've got to throw your hands up. There are all kinds of things that has to happen in order to make this idea progress. In Imagineering, I didn't do it, but it was part of the culture. Somebody years ago started a thing called an idea fair. And each year, and we do two things. Each year we would look at, everything we did was big, and so it was done by teams. And we would get the teams together to show everybody else what they were working on and what the ideas were. But we would also bring out of the archives ideas that didn't work, ideas that hadn't gotten funding, ideas that hadn't been approved. And we did it for at least two reasons. One, it reinforced the idea that failure is okay. And these teams would find that even some of the best Imagineering teams ever had projects turned down. So that I found useful. Oh, really? Even those guys didn't get something approved. Wow, that's interesting. The other thing it underlined was the fact that sometimes ideas fail not because they're not a great idea, but they fail because the timing's wrong, the funding's wrong, the atmosphere's not right, the politics are wrong, whatever it is. It made me sort of paranoid in a way to never throw ideas away, because you never know when something's going to come back or can get reshaped in a different form and maybe have a second shot. The second thing you learn is in putting these groups together is no ideas are bad ideas. The other thing you desperately need is diversity in the group who's talking to you. You know, we've always heard, you've always heard the sort of negative way of saying that guy has the creativity of an accountant. Well, accountants can be valuable in this process, but accountants are only valuable if they're sitting next to a marketing person, who's sitting next to an engineer, who's sitting next to a graphics person, who maybe has a storyteller sitting behind them. It's only when you can get this group of people and these diverse ideas together and give them, and they all have free reign and they also have a free shot at the process, that you can really get everything you need there. So if you're an accountant, the next time somebody makes fun of you, don't let them do it. You have a place there. The third thing you need during this incubation process is protection. One of the most frustrating things for anybody to hear who thinks they have a good idea is, well, we'll put it two ways. One of the things I learned is to quit asking people when things are going to be ready. My tendency as a manager was to say, okay, you guys got till Friday. Well, one of the lessons I learned in managing this process was it may or may not be ready by Friday. And if you're going to insist on Friday, then there's a high probability you're going to get a compromised product. Now, business runs on schedules and runs on budgets and nothing is endless, but you've got to figure out a leeway there and let things run as long as you think there's a reasonable way to do it. I had a guy who used to tell me you can't schedule inspiration. All you can do is have inspirational schedules, and I've sort of never forgotten that. And I think that's kind of right. So you've got to let a process develop that provides all kinds of free will, that provides all kinds of input, that gets people listening to each other, and that spark now hopefully is an idea that's got some meat on it of some kind. So the next step, I would call step 2 in this process, is the exact opposite of what I've just been talking about. and that is knowing how to stop this flow, because it can't go on forever. Art has been defined as getting something where you like it and leaving it that way. I love that definition. It's completely true in art, and I think it's also true in this process. There has to be a point, despite my prior paragraph, there has to be a point at which somebody yells, stop. And that is the first major risk point in the creative process. This is the point where you're going to try and take that idea and convert it into a set of action steps. You're going to say, okay, the dreaming's over. We think we've got enough here. We think we've got an essence here. This is the point where you start assigning tasks. You do this, you do that. So that the idea can be broken down in its component parts and you can start to test it. And that assignment phase is incredibly risky. If they're not made carefully, if the idea is not really an idea yet, then the assignments, what I've found is if you start to assign tasks and they're undoable, then that means you've closed it down too fast. Or you've got a whole series of contradictions that don't work. As soon as you transition from the pure idea to the process, the environment also has to change. For all the freedom and laughing and joking of this first no holds barred process, now you have to start introducing some discipline into the process, some boundaries, some fences. When you start assigning tasks, you're automatically going to get questions about schedule, budget, deliverables, and the nature of your answer starts to define that process. As soon as you tell somebody that they have 60 days to do something and not 6 months, or as soon as you tell them they have $1 million budget instead of a $10 million budget, you have eliminated a world of options. You've also created some opportunities, but you've also eliminated a series. So if you introduce that too quickly, then you're going to start getting that confusion that you'll start figuring out pretty soon. But if you introduce it at the right point, then it's going to breed the creative process. It's going to enable it because you quit wasting time on the $10 million ideas when you know you've only got $1 million. It's incredibly important, and it's probably the trickiest point in the entire process. And I have to tell you, doing it 30 or 40 times was my best teacher in terms of, and you make mistakes. I'm sure I've killed some things before I should have, and I sure let some things run on too long because I thought there was an essence of an idea there, and sometimes they just die of their own weight. The third point in the process, which is easy to sometimes forget, is what I call true north. It's important during this somewhat chaotic process to keep a point of reference, to keep a guidepost. As the team starts executing things, it's important to have a true north to come back to. It's the only way you can really maintain the essence and the integrity of the idea. Things get whittled, they get changed, they get diluted, not because of bad intentions, but because of the incremental changes that always happen when you try and convert this thing into a budget, or you try and convert it into a schedule of some kind. I'll give you a perfect example on a large scale, of losing your focus on true north. And it's an example of one of the things I was responsible for. We built in the late 80s and 90s, we built at Disney, we built a project in Paris called Euro Disney. It's now called Disneyland Paris. We figured out a long time ago that the word Euro was a negative in Europe before it is now. And so we renamed it Disneyland Paris. But the idea was to take the Disney experience to Europe, the Disney theme park experience to Europe. And we had a bake-off between Barcelona and Paris. Barcelona had beaches. Spanish government was a hell of a lot easier to deal with than the French government. But France was the epicenter of Europe. There were 350 million people within a one-day trip of Paris at that time, and so from an economic point of view, it was the right place to be. We got 5,000. We negotiated 5,000 acres from the French government and built the theme park. That was all part of True North. But we started listening to our own BS, and instead of all the market studies told us we should build 2,200 hotel rooms, we thought, we're Disney. So we built 5,000 hotel rooms. We thought we should build a capacity for X in the theme park. Well, we built 140X for opening day in the theme park as opposed to phasing it. That's a perfect example of a great idea that was True North, but in the execution of it, not paying attention to the essence of your idea and getting confused, forgetting about why you're there, and Disney, because Disney had a big balance sheet and they were successful, and the thing opened successfully from a consumer point of view. We were able to survive those tough early years, and it now has been incredibly successful. But I like it because it's an example of a terrific idea that gets screwed up by a whole group of smart, grown people who thought they knew what they were doing, but we lost the essence of why we were there. The fourth piece is common to, I think, every creative process I've ever seen. It happens somewhere around the bottom of the second or the top of the third inning. There's a real sense of progress, that things have come in, the early budget numbers look good, the engineers are comfortable, the integrity, that your True North is still intact. And then all of a sudden, boom, out of left field comes a surprise of some kind. The lawyers say you've got a copyright problem that they don't know how to deal with. The computer guys say there's no way, this is 3 years ahead of where the world is. There's no way we can do it. Or your CFO comes in and says you've got to cut the budget 20%. You're never sure exactly where it's going to come from, which is why it's called a surprise. But I can guarantee you, in any creative process where you're doing something new, there's going to be a huge surprise at some point that you're going to have to deal with. The secret, I think, like any surprise, is to learn not to panic, and that comes from having seen it 20 or 30 times, and a little gray hair is sometimes valuable there. But the first time you see it, there's a tendency to throw everything up in the air and run around and blame somebody else and try and figure out how it's not your fault that there's all of a sudden a 20% budget overrun. But you can't do that. This is the time when, more than anything else, you've got to get everybody who was involved back together. You've got to listen like you've never listened in your life, and you've got to retrace where you are and figure out what went wrong. And 9 times out of 10, I mean, I've gotten to this point with a couple of things where we just realized we were dead. But that's maybe 10% of my personal experience over the 40-year process. Usually there's a way out of it. And usually you'll find that you lost True North and somehow you ended up going east and building twice the number of hotel rooms that you should have, or that the technology is a problem but there's another way around it, or that lawyer was an idiot and you just need to get a better lawyer, or whatever it was. There's always a way around it. But don't panic about it, and the key to it is to listen more than you've ever listened, and listen to everybody's defense and everybody's objectives, and normally there's a way around it. The last piece is going to sound a little weird, but the last piece of this process, which I have found over my experience is incredibly important to this process, is a sense of humor. Businesses are serious. You know, this is all about pro forma and earnings and shareholder value and debt ratings and all the other things. But the fundamental creative process, if you take it too seriously, particularly in the early going, if you don't know how to laugh at yourself most importantly, and laugh with your partners, it does not lend itself to this deadly serious process that some people insist everything has to go through, because it's a process of risking yourself. If you're not willing, if you're afraid every time you say something you're going to get laughed at or shot, then your willingness to say things diminishes pretty rapidly. So this ability to create an environment where there can be a sense of fun and a sense of excitement and a sense of willingness to risk is hugely important. And that's not contrary to having a whole bunch of different dispersed expertises in the room. There are accountants with a sense of humor, and it's important to have those people and have them as part of the process. I had a graphic artist at Disney who was a closet cartoonist and a very, very funny guy, and he started doodling on his timesheets every week, and somebody in the accounting department started and his doodles were often aimed at management, me and other people, and somebody in the accounting department started posting his doodles. This was before computers were everywhere, and started posting his doodles on the drawing board, and it became on the bulletin board, and it became part of the culture of this 2,000-person organization. And computers were around then, and so things started spreading around. And it got to the point where when something would screw up, everybody would say, "Boy, I wonder what John's going to do with this on Friday." And more than once, it was at my expense, and a couple times I wanted to just go either shoot John or rip the thing off the bulletin board. But I realized very quickly you can't do it. That it was part of our vetting process. It was part of our willingness to laugh at ourselves, and they became celebrated. And we actually gave him an official way to do it, and he became sort of the Imagineering cartoonist. And I was back there a couple of years ago, and the guy's not as old as I am, but he's got to be in his late 50s or 60s, and his cartoons are still there, and he's still ragging on management. So it's they were willing to put it up, but it's just a sort of a symbol to me of the kind of place you need to create if you're going to get people who are willing to risk and willing to step up. Let me make a last point that is, it's not really a sixth point, but it's the last point that I think is important. And I think it's important when you're thinking about this creative process, but I also think the more I got to thinking about it, I think it's important particularly for this group, as you start thinking about your career and what you want to do and how you want to think about yourself. And I would generally put it under the category of, does it fit the franchise? You know, Disney was blessed with one of the strongest franchises in the world, and there were a series of values that were just built into the Disney name, and it was part of that true north, and it was part of what governed us, and it was a great luxury. You know, in the movie business, you'll hear people talk about going to a Disney movie. Well, you don't ever hear people going to a Warner Brothers movie or going to a Universal movie. Disney's the only studio that has a brand that is strong. But not everybody's going to have a brand as strong as Disney. But it's important when you're thinking about yourself, or when you're thinking about people that you want to go work for, what does that company stand for? If it doesn't have a brand, if it doesn't stand for something, if their complete strategy is we're going to go where the money is, that may work. There are hedge funds that have made that work, but it's the exception, not the rule. And I would argue in real estate, it's even more. It would be even more the exception. So as you're looking at employers and you're looking at companies, think about what they stand for. Think about what the people who run the company stand for. And franchise doesn't just mean Disney in the sense of family friendly or children. It means in the sense of who they are as a management team and how they think about the world and how they treat their employees and so on and so forth. That's all part of a franchise. And don't overlook that, because it's hugely it's just hugely important. But what is your personal franchise? What's your personal brand going to be as you develop yourself and you start putting yourself in front of employers and start thinking about how you want to represent yourself? What's your brand going to be? How are you going to think about yourself? You know, you can argue that right now you're a blank piece of paper and the reason you're here is to try and sort of fill that in. But I think to a large degree, if you stop to think about it, you already know who you are to a large degree. You already know, I didn't mean to pick on accountants here, but you already know that you hate accounting or you love accounting. Well, that's part of your brand. That's part of who you are. And the sooner you recognize that and internalize that and start treating it as a strength that you can build on, then the sooner you're going to have a leg up on your own personal brand and what that means about who you are and how you're going to position yourself eventually. You know, we all make compromises along the way. There are things like student loans and car payments that you have to deal with, and I understand that. But I think if you spend some time thinking now about who you are, then those compromises that you're inevitably going to make will be made within some guardrails. They'll be made within the context of the essence of who you are and what that is. So in that sense, you need to find your own true north. And you may find sometimes that you got to go a little west to get north. But the important thing is that north is where you're headed and north is what you believe in. And make getting yourself in a creative situation part of your search, part of your tour. It will create you, it will complete you, I think, and it will make you more valuable to yourself as a person. I think it'll also make you more valuable as you grow in your business career. If you've been part of somebody who's formed things, who's shaped things, if you've been part of a team that really has been through that process, and by the way, sometimes failure is just as important as success, then I think that's an early experience that I would encourage you to look for and think about. You may or may not be lucky enough to get a Charles Frazier or a Walt Disney who can be your muse, if you will. But there may also be a huge opportunity for you to be the anchor to windward to a Charles or to a Walt. And if you're not a Walt Disney, then maybe you're the guy who should have been around him when he was trying to do some of the stupid things he did and could have saved him an awful lot of trouble and made him even more successful than he was. An orchestra is made up of lots of instruments. Find the one you like to play and play it well. But also find an orchestra that plays the kind of music that you like. It's no fun. It's no fun being in a jazz band if you really love rock and roll. So you have an enormous opportunity here. You're in the catbird seat. I know times aren't as great as we all wish they were now, but you've got this great opportunity to build a brand, to find your true north, to get yourself exposed to this process. And I think from my own experience, these are the things that will make your career faster, more efficient, more rewarding, both financially as well as emotionally. And I hope you find it. Thank you. Questions? Happy to, if we have time, I'm happy to take questions on any subject. Yes, sir.
What would you consider the biggest mistake in your career and how did you pass it?
Boy, that's a great question. You know, it's hard. I'm going to cop out a little bit, but some of the biggest mistakes I made were early on, but the big mistakes are the ones you make at the end. I went to work. I spent a couple of years running the real estate for the Rockefeller Foundation in New York, and I did it for all the wrong reasons. I got mesmerized by the Rockefeller name. I was single. They were going to pay me a lot of money. I was going to live in New York, and it seemed pretty heady, and it was. But it was back to my true north. I mean, it was basically, I had been a developer for Frazier. I'd been in this incredibly interesting environment, and then I'd gone to work for a Florida developer called Arvida, and it had been equally rewarding. But I got mesmerized by the Rockefeller name, and the fact that it was, you know, it was Rockefeller. It was 17 million square feet of stuff in Midtown Manhattan, and he had a big industrial park in northern New Jersey and plans to do other things. Well, it was just a big, dumb property management job. And I wasn't a property manager, I was a developer. And I got in the middle of the Rockefeller, I got between David and his older brother in terms of the politics of the Rockefeller family. I didn't do the research because I got memorized by the franchise. And I think it's an example, I hadn't thought about it, but it's an example of what I was just talking about. It was a mistake. I got out of it because another lesson I think you learn is I left Arvida on very good terms. Arvida, in the 2 years I was gone, Arvida was bought by Disney. And so when I realized that Rockefeller was a mistake, I still had friends at Arvida that were now part of Disney. That's how I got into Disney. I went back. One of the hardest things I've ever done is gone back to the people who, you know, I left in a cloud of dust. But for some reason, I left them, and I haven't always done this in my life, but I left them with style, and I left them with a sense of appreciation. And, you know, the older you get, the more you realize. I have a friend of mine who's 85 who's convinced there are only 400 people in the world. The older you get, the more you're going to start meeting people everywhere. And don't burn bridges, particularly when you're in the early parts of your career. Do not burn bridges, because you never know. Particularly if, I mean, the real estate world may seem like a huge, vast world. Well, trust me, I've been in it for 43 years, and it's like a little fraternity. And you can't turn around without bumping into somebody who either used to work for you, or you used to work for, or you know, or knows your best friend, or whatever it is. So that would be on the list. Yes?
During your experience with Disney, I know you said that you were missing Walt Disney, and as a visionary was missing like that component of a controlling factor. What do you think exactly it needed that would have made the company more successful?
You know, it's hard to imagine Walt Disney being more successful than he was, but if you peel back the onion and look at it, you'll find that an enormous amount of it was unbelievably inefficient. Now, the creative process is by definition inefficient to some degree, but if he had had, and I'm mimicking stuff that when I came in and took over Imagineering, there were a lot of Imagineers there who knew Walt. And so this is firsthand experience, although I didn't know him personally. These are people who worked for him, and they would tell the stories all day long. There's an inherent inefficiency in one-handed clapping that he was able to muscle his way through because he had a little bit of staying power. He'd done very well early on, and he had a cushion. And he also was just, I think, how many of you have read Walter Isaacson's book on Steve Jobs? It's worth reading if you haven't read it. Disney was a little bit like Steve Jobs. He was mean. Walt Disney was an alcoholic when he died, impossible to get along with. But I'm not suggesting Steve Jobs was an alcoholic, but he was hard to get along with, and a pain in the ass. And it was his way or the highway. Now, they both were very, very creative people, but there are very few Walt Disneys and very few Steve Jobs in this world. And the chances of you being one, with all due respect, is probably less than 100%. And so you're more likely to run into somebody who is just full of energy and got bright ideas and great ideas and wants to do things, and they're going to need help. They're going to need process. And the short answer to your question is Disneyland could have been built in half the time that it took him to build it, because he wouldn't listen to anybody, and he kept screwing around with things, and things fell down and didn't work, and so on. But the essence of the idea, in the 1950s, the Disney theme park was the equivalent of the iPod. I mean, it was that novel an idea when it happened in the 1950s. And they both deserve credit for breaking that ground. But those people don't come along very often, and you're probably not going to be lucky enough to work for one of them. Yes, sir?
I was going to ask about your time at St. Joe and whenever the bust occurred, and what you think you guys could have done to protect yourselves from that, and just, you know, what you learned from that process as a whole, like the warning signs and that kind of thing.
It's a good question. I left in. This is going to sound a little bit defensive, because I am a little bit defensive, and I'll explain why. I left in a long-planned retirement. I had my replacement was our chief operating officer. I left in May of 2008, and we already saw the writing on the wall. 6 was in the second home resort business. 06 was the zenith. It just didn't get any better. 7, things were starting to slow down dramatically. We sold off the commercial division. We sold off the home building division. We sold all of our commercial properties. We did a secondary offering, which Wall Street told us we shouldn't do. And when I left the company, I left it with 0 debt on the balance sheet and $400 or $500 million worth of money of cash in the bank. And we were in good shape. But the end was clearly coming. But we had built it to withstand. We shrunk it. We also shrunk the company from, I forgot the numbers exactly, from hundreds and hundreds to like 150 people. So we were ready for what, I didn't know it was going to be as severe as it was, but we knew there was something coming. So I think we all deserve good marks for doing that. There was a hedge fund manager who was starting to invest in Joe at the time, a guy named, he's a Miami hedge fund manager, I'll think of his name. I've blocked it out of my mind because I so don't like him. Berkowitz, who started investing in Joe and got control. After I left, got control. And he was a very good hedge fund manager. He ran a series of funds you guys would know the name of, and the Fairholme funds, and been very successful. He was a mutual fund man of the decade, and so he had a very good track record. But he thought he was a real estate developer, and he got control of the company and came in and tried to run it, and changed the board and got rid of all of management, and thought he could run a real estate development company the same way you run a mutual fund company. Well, they don't work the same. Just like I couldn't go run a mutual fund company. And so at the absolute worst time in the cycle, when things are terrible, which is when you need experience and people who've been around and people who know what they're doing, he brought in completely new blood, and they've wallowed ever since. So it was personally tough to watch, just because I was there for 11 or 12 years, and you get emotionally invested in those things. I think that's a little defensive, but the facts are accurate. I mean, those are the actual facts, and I think most people would agree with except Berkowitz, he wouldn't agree. The rest of them, I think, would agree. Yes, sir.
What's your outlook on the economy going forward, and where do you see perils? Are we really at a village, or are we just propped up by artificial stimulus or what?
I wish I I wish I had a rosy answer. I am, I think we're in, I'm not gonna let this turn political, but I think we're in a tough spot. Some pieces of the real estate business have come back. I'm on the board of one of the biggest apartment REITs. We are blowing and going. But the reason we're blowing and going is because the single family business is still in the doldrums. The only reason the single family business is not better, the single family stocks are better, because everybody on Wall Street is trying to get in ahead of the crowd, and so they've pushed these things up 50 and 60%, but the numbers don't deserve it, they don't warrant it. Most segments of the business are doing okay because we're at, you can make almost anything work when you borrow money at 2%. But that is not the real world. We have the Fed and other people have abnormally depressed rates, which maybe was a good idea, but there's, as we come out of that, it's gonna make a lot of stuff look funny that seem to make sense right now. I think Europe's a time bomb, and I don't, it's beyond me how the Euro holds together. I just don't. I spent a lot of time in Europe with my ULI work, and I'm really mimicking German bankers and French bankers, people who know more about it than I do. It's what you hear in from the talking heads is one thing, but what these guys will tell you over a dinner and a glass of wine is something else. It's a scary negative environment, and that's a big part of the world. I was in China. I was in Beijing last month, and it's the real estate bubble is very rapidly unwinding in most parts of China. So, is the world going to end? No. But I think it's going to be a sideways world and I'm living my personal life and making my personal portfolio decisions based on a sideways world for the next few years. I just don't see any. I don't see any bounce. I think we've got to slug it out. And this is not. I've been through 74, 81, 87, 94, 2001, however many that is. Those are all recessions. And so I've seen 6 of them. This ain't like that. This is fundamentally different. Sorry to not be more upbeat. Yes, sir.
Follow up on that, what parallels do you draw from some of the earlier ones or some of the worst ones? And how do you find a niche, find optimism, find something that works, especially in your industry where it's one of the only things that is really not working?
Well, there are always opportunities. There are always local opportunities. One of the nice things about one of the reasons there's no General Motors, that's a bad example, no IBM of the real estate business is because it's a fundamentally local business. And even at the big apartment REIT I'm on, we have divisions on both coasts. We only build in the high barrier to entry markets, but the guys in San Francisco are basically entrepreneurs with a big balance sheet. And the reason this company is successful is because they let San Francisco be San Francisco. And there are opportunities there, and there are opportunities other places. And they're always going to be those sort of niches where there's an opportunity to redo something, or somebody's left something behind, or somebody got it wrong the first time and you can get it for 30 cents on the dollar and do it right this time. But that's hard to build a business out of. It's a great way to maybe make some individual money if you've got some capital and you've got some capability. But it's hard to build a business around that. The fundamental issue is everybody says it's unemployment. I think more than unemployment, I think it's attitude. I mean, I think people are less risk of, my friends and the people I talk to who are mostly younger than I am, I've never seen people more risk averse than they are right now. And the way you start new businesses and the way you do things is by taking a risk. And with prime at, what is it, 1 or 1.13 or whatever it is, And you can, my God, you can borrow a 30-year fixed rate mortgage for under 4%. That's unheard of. But that's still a monthly commitment for 30 years. And if you're not sure you're going to have a job, that's a risk. And so there's the leadership issue is getting a sense of comfort back in the world or in the country that tomorrow is going to be better than yesterday, and we've lost that. That's you've all seen the surveys that show that your parents are worried that for the first time you're maybe not going to have it as good as they did. That's a kind of universal sentiment that is now that you're seeing in all kinds of surveys. That's the first time in my life I've seen that, and now I don't think that's true. I think I'm in the Warren Buffett camp. Never bet against America, but it's going to take some time to get there, and I think we need to be careful in that journey. Yes, sir.
Yeah, it sounds like you've traveled around. Did you recommend any other countries, over America to live in? That's a great question. I'm a member of an informal real estate group that meets once a year in Chicago, and it's CEOs from around the world, and it's an informal group. A guy named Sam Zell put it together 20 years ago, and we just met last month in Chicago. When everybody's there are about 90 people there, and it's even better than ULI, frankly, because it's smaller. It's a concentrated cross section of CEOs, and it's hard to find a bright spot. Sam has been investing like crazy in Brazil for the last four or 5 years, and he keeps telling us, guys, you got to come to South America. Brazil's where it's going to be. Well, he's quit. Demographics have turned against it. Government bureaucracy, fundamental political leadership has gotten iffy. I don't know enough of the details, but that's just an example of a bright spot from a very smart guy that is cool. China is really, I've spent a lot of time in China, and I know it reasonably well. It is just enormous. It just boggles the mind how big it is. And it's not going away, and it's going to be a player, and it's going to be a power. But on a short-term basis, it would be a risky place to go try to invest money right now. Europe is a quagmire, and doesn't know who it is. And so the irony is, I think if you're probably sitting in the best investment in the world right now. For all of its problems, the United States is probably as safe a haven. The dollar is probably as safe as any other currency. The politics, despite all of our shooting ourselves in both feet, is still healthier than any place else. So, despite our problems, in terms of my own personal investing, I'm doing some things offshore, but an awful lot of my stuff is here, and I feel comfortable with it. Yeah, yes, excuse me.
I come from Europe, and I'd like to know if you feel that in Europe we have a different creative process than we have in America. Do you feel any difference working with European team, that we have a different approach towards creativity?
Well, that's a great question. My only real experience is with the French and the Spanish. When we were building Disneyland Paris, we had Dutch and Germans and Italians. We had a management team from all over, but the sort of the country experience was really more French than anything else. I would not, if I was trying to start a creative company, I would not move it to Paris. The French, God bless them, are engineers and they're bureaucrats. It is not an accident that the word bureaucracy is a French word. And you sound like you might be French. Yeah. So with being candid here, you asked the question. It took some time, frankly, to get them used to some of those early stages I was talking about, where you're sort of free for all kind of stuff. They kept trying to shut it down. They kept trying to let the engineer talk, you know, or I mean, it was an interesting sort of cultural process. The Spanish weren't like that. The Spanish were much more willing to sort of go with it. And beyond that, I really haven't had the experience. We found that the Dutch and the Germans made great project managers, but because by the time you give it to a project manager, you just got to get it built on time and on budget, and they were great at that. But they didn't suffer fools, and I'm generalizing here, but they were very good taskmasters. The English just kind of wanted to talk about everything. So, I'm being unfair to everybody, but I think I'll stick with that. Other questions? Good luck to you all. Thank you very much. Thank you.